Thank you. Thank you to our hosts this evening. Thank you for opening your homes. Welcome, everybody. We're going to address this evening, Be'ezer Hashem, one pasuk in Megillas Rus, that when one reads it, at the surface, it's extremely perplexing, extremely difficult to understand. Everybody knows that the story of Rus that is read on Shavuos by Jewish communities the world over takes place takes place sometime during the time of the Shoftim, the judges. But when is that time? That can be 390 years from the death of Yehoshua ben Nun and the beginning of the era of the judges, all the way till the anointment, the coronation of King Shaul, is almost 400 years. Somewhere at that time, the story of Rus takes place. Was it in the beginning, in the middle, at the end? According to most opinions, closer to the time of Shmuel and Shaul. And during this time, there's a man, Elimelech, has a wife, Naomi. They leave Eretz Yisrael, they move to Moav. They have two children, Machlin and Kilian. Tragedy strikes the family. Elimelech dies. His two sons, Machlin and Kilian, who in the interim marry two Moabite princesses, Rus and Arpa. And the two husbands, the two young men, also pass away. So Naomi is left alone, a widow, lost her husband Elimelech, lost both of her sons. She's left with her two daughters-in-law, Rus and Arpa. Naturally, Naomi turns to her two daughters-in-law and says, "You have no future with me. Go back home, go back to Moav, build for yourself a bright life." Vatishak Arpa lachamoisa v'Rus dafka. Arpa kisses her mother-in-law goodbye, but Rus decides to cleave, to remain davuk to Naomi and to follow her back to the land of the Jewish people. In that unforgettable phrase in first chapter of Rus, Rus tells her mother-in-law Naomi, "Ba'asher telchi eleich, ba'asher tolini olin, amech ami, elekayich elekai, ba'asher tamusi amus v'shomeh kover." Wherever you go, I go. Where you dwell, I dwell. Your people is my people. Your God is my God. Where you die, I die, and that's where I will be buried. Probably the first and last time a daughter-in-law said that to a mother-in-law. They come back to Beis Lechem, Naomi's original hometown from where she and her husband and their children left. They are impoverished. They are penniless. They are completely broke without anything. And as we know, Rus goes to a field to be able to collect those parts of the field, the lekha, the shikha, the payah, those parts of the field that were designated for the poor. Boaz, whose field Rus happens to chance, takes an interest in this young woman, Rus, treats her with dignity, treats her with majesty, takes care of her. And this is the moment that Naomi sets up the situation where she sends Rus one night, in the middle of the night, when Boaz is winnowing his grain. She explains to her daughter-in-law that Boaz is a relative. How is he a relative? Because Naomi was married to Elimelech, Rus's father-in-law. And Elimelech, of course, he was an uncle of Boaz. Elimelech had a few brothers. And one of the brothers was Boaz's father. Salmon was Boaz's father, which means Boaz was Elimelech's nephew. So Rus's husband was Boaz's first cousin. He's a relative of ours. And Rus meets him, and basically Rus asks Boaz to marry her. Boaz says there's a closer relative. There's a closer relative than him. He is a first cousin of her husband. Rus wants, as Naomi wants, he should marry her, so that way the legacy, the memory of Machlon, Rus's husband, Naomi's son, should be perpetuated through his widow, who's marrying somebody in the family, some form with a semblance to Yibum, although not exactly. But Boaz says there's somebody closer. There's Ploini Almoini. Ploini Almoini is Boaz's uncle, and he is a much closer relative to Rus. So we're going to offer him first. If he says no, then I'll take it. I'm next in line. And this is the pasuk. Boaz, in the morning, what does he do? He offers the shidduch to this other man. Vayomer Hagoyel, in Rus Perek Dalet pasuk of Vayomer Hagoyel, the potential redeemer says, Lo uchal ligoli. I can't do it. Pen ashchis es nachalosi. I might destroy my inheritance. You do it, Boaz. I can't marry. I can't marry this woman. Zokt Rashi, what was he saying? I might destroy my inheritance. So Rashi says, "Ben ashchis es nachalosi." Nachalosi means zari. My descendants, my children. I will destroy my children. Why? Why will I destroy my children? Zokt Rashi, loses pegam bezari. I will create a blemish among my descendants. Shenemar, lo yavoi amoini umayavi. Pasuk says in Parshas Kiseitze that an Ammonite and a Moabite, even if they convert to Judaism and they become full Jews, lo yavoi amoini umayavi b'kahal Hashem. An Ammonite and a Moabite cannot enter into Kahal Hashem, meaning they can become Jewish, but they cannot marry an ordinary Jewish spouse. And if yes, the children that are born from that marriage, they remain in the status of Ammonites or Moabites who also can't marry an ordinary Jewish spouse. So this man is taining. Rus comes from Moab. She's a Moabite. I'm going to marry her. All the children. What happens with the children? Panash Chizari. I don't want to destroy. I don't want to blemish my kids. Forever. They're coming from a Moabite mother. If they're coming from a Moabite mother, they can't marry. They can't marry an ordinary Jewish son, an ordinary Jewish spouse. I'm not going to do it. You can do it. I'm not going to do it. So Boaz marries. Boaz marries Rus. And as the pasuk describes, that Boaz gathers 10 people. He enters into a covenant with marriage. They bless them. Of course, Rus gives birth to a son named Oved. Oved will become the father of a boy named Yishai, who will one day become the father of David HaMelech. And the rest is, as they say, not his story, but her story. It's probably more appropriate in this case. Between Rus and Naomi, it's more her story than his story. When we think about this Rashi, there's something very strange. What says pen ashchis es nachalosi? I may destroy, I may blemish. Oops. Pen ashchis. Pen ashchis es nachalosi. I may blemish my descendants. Why? Because layove amoini umayove bekal Hashem. What's the kasha here? What do you mean? Let's say you won't have children. There's an issur on yourself. What does it do with your children? You're not allowed to marry a Moabite woman. So a Jew is not allowed to enter into such a marriage. Let's say you won't have children. Why does he talk about his children? Pen ashchis es nachalosi. My descendants won't be able to marry ordinary girls or ordinary boys. What about you yourself? Let's say you'll never have children. You're allowed to transgress on Isser min HaTorah layavi amoini mayavi b'kal Hashem. He doesn't talk about himself. What's more, he tells Boaz, you do it. What do you mean you do it? If you're not allowed to do it, how is Boaz allowed to do it? If it's prohibited, it's prohibited. So he doesn't talk about his own prohibition. He speaks about his children, and he tells Boaz, go ahead and do it. He says, nobody's allowed to do it. You can't marry her. This question the Marsha asks in Masechta Yevamos. Marsha answers that this man wasn't worried about himself. Why not? Because, this is what the Marsha says, Yibum is a mitzvah's aseh. An essay is doicha loisas. An essay overrides a loisas. Lo yavai amayne meyavi is a loisas. Yibum is an essay. You look at the Marsha, you wonder, what do you mean Yibum? Yibum is a brother-in-law. Yibum is the present Kisetzi. There's two brothers, Yeshu Achim Yachta. One of them married, dies childless. So there's a mitzvah that the other brother, if he wants and she wants, he marries the widow. Where's their brother-in-law? This was Machlin's brother. This is Boyas. Where's the Yibum? Shah brings the Ramban. The Ramban writes in Vayeshev about Yehuda and Tamar that before Matan Torah, Yibum was not only to a brother-in-law, it was to the closest kin in the family. And that was the basis for the relationship between Tamar and Yehuda. Because Yehuda had three sons, Eir, Oinan, and Shelah. Tamar married Eir, and Eir died. So in the process of Yibum, Tamar married her brother-in-law. Oinan died, also childless. So Tamar should have married Shelah. Yehuda didn't want. So Tamar entered into a relationship with Yehuda, which was her father-in-law, because before Matan Torah, the concept of Yibum, which the Ramban says contains great mysteries, was not only to a brother-in-law, it was to the closest of kin. But I ask you a shayla. This is after Matan Torah v'hibi mei shvaita shoifta. And even if you're going to say there's a symbolic significance in Boaz marrying his first cousin Rus, the concept of Yibum, you can call it a mitzvah's essay, which is doicha loisasa loyavi amoynim yavi b'kal Hashem. And nonetheless, the man, Kal Blutik, says, for me, I would do it. What do you mean if you believe it's an Isser, it's an Isser? Elamai, you believe it's not an Isser. So then there's no problem with your children. And if you believe it's not an Isser, and that's why Boyas can do it, so you can also do it. And Rashi apparently doesn't say a word about this. To understand this, and to see what's contained in this single pasuk, and this single Rashi, we have to address one of those extraordinary stories in Gemara. The story is a Masechta Yevamis, Daf Ayin Vav Omid Beis. It's a long story, very long story, but I want to select a few key lines from the Gemara. Says the Mishnah, Masechta Yevamis, the 8th Perek, Daf Ayin Vav Omid Beis. Amoyni umayavi asurin v'isuran isur oilam. A member of the nation of Ammon and Moav may not marry an ordinary Jewish spouse, and it's forever. Meaning, if they do marry an ordinary Jewish spouse, they have children, and those children marry ordinary Jews, 10 generations later, 20 generations later, ad oilam. 30, 40 generations later, because they are descendants of a spouse, either we'll see in a moment, but we would think either male or female who comes from Ammon and Moav, so there is something inherent there. The Torah says, they can be Jewish, they're fully Jewish. Doesn't mean they can't be Jewish, they can be fully Jewish, but when it comes to marriage, they have to marry one of their own. Or they can marry a convert, they can marry a servant who was liberated, or a shifcha, a maid who was liberated. They can marry a mamzer, they can marry a mamzeres. The reason is because it says, Lo yavoy b'kahal Hashem. Kahal gerim lo ikri kal. The convert is an individualist. The convert chooses his or her path to God alone. They don't come with a kehillah, with a shtibel, with a yichis. Like the Rambam writes, Rabbi YY Hager, we trace our lineage to Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. You trace your lineage, Lemisha Amar V'Haya Olam. You're a child of the Rebbeinu Shalom directly. Kahal Geirim Lo Yikri Kol. It's not called Kahal Hashem. So it's not because the convert is inferior in any way. It's not considered the community of the Jewish people. The convert chose an isolated, individualistic path, detached from a family, from a background. So the Moabite could marry the convert, no problem. But marry an ordinary Jew, so for generations later, it's ad oilam, the prohibition still exists. Zok the Mishnah, avol nikvaiseyem utorois miyad. The female Ammonite and Moabite, this is many years before feminism. The female Ammonite and Moabite, no problem. They convert, they can marry any Jew they want. I mean, they could marry the regular Jew. That's a Mishnah. Zog the Gemara Minana Mili. How do you know? How do you know? It says Lo Yavei Amoini Mayavi. How do you know it's males and not females? I would say any Ammonite, any Moabite. How do you know? Amar Rabbi Yochanan and a whole mice. Shaul HaMelech sees David, who was victorious, who triumphed over Goliath. Goliath, who happened to be David's relative. We once gave a shear on it because who was Goliath's mother? Orpah. And Orpah was Ruth's sister. So David and Goliath were not as far as we think they are. They understood one another. They had similar blood flowing in the sinews, but they went in opposite ways. But David and Goliath, David confronts Goliath, he defeats Goliath. Shaul wants to know, he asks his commander-in-chief Avner, who is this? Who is this man? Miza ben Miza Anar. Avner says, I don't know. And the Gemara discusses the whole story. What's Pshat? He doesn't know. Agan Sarichis. The Gemara says what Shaul was asking Avner was not who he is. Shaul knew well who he was. He wanted to know if he comes from Peretz. If he comes from Zarach, he knew he came from Yehuda, but he didn't know if he comes from Peretz. If he comes from Zarach, if he's from Zarach, he's prominent. If he's from Peretz, he's dangerous. If he's from Zarach, he's Choshev. If he's from Peretz, Melech Peretz Geder, he comes from a line of royalty. Who mixes into the conversation? Doyeg HaDoimi, the infamous Doyeg who always had what to say at the right time, says, Your Majesty, before you start asking Shilas if he's worthy to be royal, why don't we first establish if he's worthy to marry a Jewish bride? Why? Because his Baba was Rus. His great-grandmother was Rus. His father is Yishai. His father is Ovid. His mother is Rus. His great-grandmother is Rus. She's a Moabite. The children who come from such a marriage cannot marry Jews, even 20 generations later. So Avner, the commander-in-chief, mixes it. And Avner tells Doyeg and Shaul, Taneina. We learned this. We have a tradition. Amoyni v'loy amoynis. Mayavi v'loy mayavis. It says lo yave amoyni u'mayavi. In Lashon Zachar, not Lashon Nekeva. Mayavis is fine. Rus was a mayavis. She wasn't a mayavi. David comes from Rus. It's fine. Doyeg says, really? So when it says mamzer, it means mamzer v'loy mamzeres. So a mamzeres, a female that's born from an adulterous relationship, it's no issue, really? Avner says, no, there it says mamzer. Mamzer, the word means mum-zar, the blemish that comes because of adultery. That applies to both. Okay. So Doyeg says, but when it says mitzri, by a mitzri, you have already third generation could come B'Kal Hashem, right? If a mitzri converts, so he can't marry, the second generation can, but already the third generation could marry, should be mitzri v'loy mitzris. So he says, no, here it's different. Mitzri includes a mitzris, but here the Torah gives a reason why Amoyni Mayavi can't come B'Kal Hashem. What's the reason? Shaloi kidmu eschem belechem u'b'mayim. When the Jews were in the desert, stranded, hungry, they didn't greet you with bread and water. Darka shalish lekadim v'loy darka shalish lekadim. The women are not guilty. It wasn't their job. The men were supposed to go out and greet them. What do you want from the women? So Doyeg says, 1 second. Why can the women be hospitable to the women? The women of Ammon and Moab are also guilty. Ishtik. Avner was quiet. He proved to him Amoyni doesn't mean V'loy Amoynis, Mayavi doesn't mean V'loy Mayavis. It includes men and women identically. There's no reason to exclude women from this pasuk, just like you don't exclude them from Mamzer, you don't exclude them from Mitzvah. So what happens? So Shaul HaMelech says, go to the yeshiva, go to the Beis Medrash and find out. What do we do? So Avner goes to the Beis HaMedrash, and the Gemara doesn't have to say that Doyeg followed him or ran ahead of him. And he asks, what's the halacha with a female Moabite? Amrule, amoyni v'loy amoynis, mayavi v'loy mayavis. That's what they tell him. So Doyeg says, what are you talking about? Akshilu Doyeg kol hani kushyasa. Doyeg asks all of his questions. Ishtiku. Now they're also quiet. Avner was silenced. The whole yeshiva was silenced. Doyeg says, ich will a psak. I want a verdict. They were about to declare David HaMelech and anyone who comes from that lineage as forbidden to marry an ordinary Jewish spouse. Miyad, what happens? There's a man named Amasa ben Isha Shema Yisra Seili Ashabal Avigail Bas Nachash. Bas Nachash. Amasa gets up. Omarov Melamed Shechagar Charboy Ki Yishmael v'yomar kol mi she'enu shemei halacha zu yidoker b'cherev. He girdles himself with a sword. He says, whoever does not obey this halacha shall be stabbed with a sword. Kach mekublani mi beis dinoi shel Shmuel haramasi amoini v'lei amoinis mayavi v'lei mayavis. We heard this from the Beis Din of Shmuel haramasi. Shmuel Hanavi, who said in his Beis Din amoini v'lei amoinis mayavi v'lei mayavis. So the Gemara says, how can this guy be believed? He was a relative. He also married Yishai's daughter. Of course he's saying that. He's protecting his own children. So the Gemara, Shmuel and his Beis Din was still around. You can go ask them. So there's no issue of being Negeya B'Davar because it's something that you can verify in the Beis Din. He wouldn't be able to lie. Frag the Gemara, Kasha, but why would you exclude women? What's the Havana? So the Gemara answers, Kol Kvuda Bas Melech Pnima. One answer, another answer is, Aye Sorei Ishtecha. Hineva oil, and therefore the Ammonite and Moabite women were not carrying responsibility for not greeting the Jews. They were entitled to remain home and nurture themselves and their families, and therefore Rus was completely eligible to marry Boaz, and David HaMelech, who's her great-grandson, is perfectly kosher on all levels. Doeg was silenced, and David prevailed. And then the sugya continues. Etc. I ask you a question. This is how you resolve a halacha? There's a question of Beis Medrash. Doeg is speaking rationally. You girdle yourself with a sword and you say, hey, listen, if you accept this halacha, good. If not, yidake b'cherev. We call it today terrorism. What do you mean, yidake b'cherev? That's how you establish halacha? With a sword in the hand? That's antithetical to the whole system of halacha. The system of halacha has a formula. This Torah Shabbat, this Torah Shabbat Ped, this Yud Gimel Mid, this Beis Din, this Svara, this halacha l'Moshe Messina. Where does a sword come into the picture? The question is even more. What's the basis for refuting Doeg? He says, Kach mikoblani bebeis dinoi shel Shmuel haramasi. This is what I heard from the Beis Din of Shmuel Hanavi. Okay, so you heard it in the Beis Din. That's what Avner told Doeg. Avner told Shaul and Doeg, Taneina, we have a tradition. We learned it. Doeg said, I don't care what you learned. It doesn't make sense. They made a mistake. They misinterpreted the pasuk. They distorted the pasuk. And he came to the Beis Medrash, and they said again, Amoini v'loy amoinis, we have this tradition. Doeg said, I don't care, it's a mistaken tradition. It's a wrong pshat. And they're all silenced. I said, Taneina. Okay, so Taneina. They made a mistake. What happens now suddenly? He doesn't refute the logic. He says, okay, so maybe they also made a mistake, the same tradition. They had one pshat, I'm telling you, it's a wrong pshat. It's a wrong pshat. Achrei Rabbim Lahatos, we follow logic according to the formulas of Torah. What happened? He doesn't refute the arguments of Doeg. He doesn't prove Amoini means not an Amoinis, Moavi means not an Moavi. He just says Shmuel Paskin. So Doeg should have said, so he Paskin. I'm telling you, it was a wrong psak. Suddenly now it's satisfied. It's silenced. The question is even more. The Gemara says, how did Boaz marry Rus? How did Boaz marry Rus? Boaz was a shayfet. He was a judge. The Gemara says about Basra, Iftzan Zeh Boaz, he was one of the shayfetim. That day he gathered the Beis Din, he gathered the Sanhedrin, and they paskined up Amoini v'loy amoinis, Mayavi v'loy mayavis. And that is how he could marry Rus. So 1 second. When he says, Kach mekablani me Beis Din shel Shmuel haramasi, suddenly it's all good. Why didn't he say, Kach mekablani me Beis Din shel Boaz? Before Shmuel. Boaz was 4 generations earlier. He was one of the Shaiftim. Mekablani me Beis Din shel Boaz doesn't mention that. Indeed, Doeg comes and refutes refutes a psak din of Boaz? Why can he refute the psak of Boaz and he can't refute the psak of Shmuel? Which brings me back to the Goyel, to our good friend Pliny Almoini, Boaz's uncle, Elimelech's brother, who refuses to marry his niece, who refuses to marry Ruth, even though he's a closer relative. Why? He says, I'm not going to destroy my children. If Boaz is a shayfet, if it's the halacha, you don't have to worry, not about you, not about your children. Ruth is a woman, she's not a man. Elamai Boaz is not a shayfet, so it's not only a problem with your children, it's a problem with you, it's a problem with Boaz. There's something going on here. What's pshat? Is it right? Is it wrong? Sometimes it's right, sometimes it's wrong. Certain things we accept, certain things we don't accept. Is there a logic here? Is there a pattern here? Is there a philosophy here? Is there a shita? How do we understand this whole mahalach, this whole shakla v'tarya? So before we go weiter, to dramatize the question a bit more, a word from the Vilna Gaon, a word from the Chidah, and a word from a contemporary sage. Zog the Vilna Gaon, it says in Tehillim, David HaMelech says, Sorim Tehillim Kuf Yutes, Sorim ridafuni chinam, umidvarcha pachad libi. Ministers, governors, leaders have persecuted me in vain. From your word, my heart dreads. Sos anoichi alim rasecha, kemoitzi shalarav. But I dance, I celebrate your sayings like somebody who found a lot of booty. One sec. Midvarcha pachad libi. From your words I dread your words, but I dance with your sayings. What's pshat? Rabbeinu Bechaya says, Dvorcha is Torah shebiksav. Imrasecha is Torah shebal peh. Taiches the Vilna Gaon, Midvorcha, David HaMelech says, Pachad libi. Says, Lo yavei amoini, mo yavei bekal Hashem. And I come from Rus. Sos anoichi alim rasecha. When the sages declared, Amoini v'lo yamoinis, mo yavei v'lo yavis, now I can start dancing. Zog de Chidah, take a look at Megillas Rus. Every single pasuk starts with a vav. It's fascinating. There's not one pasuk that doesn't start with a vav. From Vayihi b'mei Shvayta, all the way through every pasuk with a vav. He says, besides 8 psukim, and if you look at those 8 psukim, each of them begins with the letters that make up the 2 words, Yishi ba'oyhel. My salvation is in the tent. Those are the only 8 psukim. They make up those letters. Yishi ba. Why? The salvation of David is from the words, Hine ba'oyel. Ayisori ishtecha. Hine ba'oyel. She's in the tent. That's why we can justify Mayavi v'loy Mayavis, because they didn't have to come out, because Hine ba'oyel. That's why those words are unique. In the early 50s, the Israeli government, headed by Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion, wanted to institute what was known then as Giyus Bonos, drafting all Jewish girls, all Jewish young women into military service. Great commotion in Eretz Yisrael. Ben-Gurion went to see the Chazon Ish then, famous Maisa, the 2 wagons. It was quite an intense time. Well, in Israel, every time is an intense time. But then it was also intense. It was very intense. Giyus Bonos, the early Yisrael felt this was something very serious. What was at stake was the Kedusha of Bnei Yisrael, etc. So they tell a Maisa that Ben-Gurion was having a conversation with one of the Gedolei Yisrael at the time. And the man was accusing him. He says, you're really undermining a core value of your people. He says, I'm undermining a core value. Really, you know what my name is? My name is David. You know who I'm named after? I'm named after David HaMelech. You're telling me that I'm undermining the Jewish people? I'm like David HaMelech, Prime Minister of the new state of Israel. He says, yeah, but through your work, of course you're named after David, and through your work, you're trying to make the first David not completely Jewish. He says, why? He says, if you're going to draft the Jewish girls to the army, is the pshat that darka shali shalotzes. So you can't say anymore, Amoini v'loy amoinis, Mayavi v'loy mayavis, right? Because the basis is, ain't darka shalish lekadim, but you're drafting them to the army, so you're saying darka shalish. So therefore, it's a mayavis too, so therefore David is not a complete Jew. So you're talking name David, and you're trying to make David the incomplete Jew. And Ben-Gurion liked the vart. Remember? But when we take this one step further, the enigma wrapped in mystery becomes even more dramatic. We look at Shmuel Aleph Perek Tezayin. The Rebbeinu Shalom sends Shmuel Hanavi to anoint a new king in lieu of Shaul. And there's a very strange pasuk there that at first glance is extremely difficult to understand. What happens? Shmuel asks Yishai to bring him his children so he can anoint one of them. So the pasuk Shmuel Aleph Perek Tezayin pasuk Yud Vayaver Yishai Shivas Bonav Lifnei Shmuel. Yishai passes his 7 sons in front of Shmuel. Vayomer Shmuel El Yishai Loi Bocher Hashem Be'ela. God didn't choose any of them. Vayomer Shmuel El Yishai Hatamu Hanarim. Do you have no more children? Vayomer, yeah, I still have one child. He's a shepherd. Bring him, David. One second. He asked you to bring all of his kids, so why didn't you bring 8 children? No, he brings 7. Then he says, is everyone finished? I have one more. Really? You forgot how many children you have? This is the source that men are clueless? Why didn't he bring David in the beginning? What happened? Difficult to understand. So there's a medrash, it's hafla, a medrash that's brought in many, many svarim. Biur Hagra brings it in Shulchan Aruch, it's brought in Arizal brings it, Likutei Torah brings it, Chidab, it's brought in Hamoin Svarim. It's different medrash. The story goes that Yishai at some point separated from his wife. But he knew that he's still supposed to have children. So what did he do? He told his shivchi, he told his maid, that he wants to be with her. His maid went to her master, Yishai's wife, and told her the Maisa. Said tonight, told me he wants to be with me. It will be dark in the house. It's before Edison's days. I'll leave, you'll come in. Fine. The Chidar writes that she was a Gilgul of Hagar. And Hagar was disrespectful to her master. So she was Masak Hagar, so she was extremely respectful to her master. So Yishai, unbeknowingly, has relations with his wife. He thinks it's his mate. His wife now becomes pregnant. Yishai thinks, what happened? There was an adultery here. There was no, he never divorced her. Now she has a baby boy. He doesn't know it's his baby. He thinks it's another man. David HaMelech says in Tehillim, Muzar ha'yisi le'echoi v'nochri libnei imi. I was a mamzer, I was a stranger. Muzar, muzar. I was a stranger to my brothers, and I was an alien to the children of my mother. Why? Why muzar ha'yisi le'echoi? They didn't consider him their brother. Came from the same mother, but not from the same father, and came from a relationship that from their perspective was completely immoral, illegal, illicit, promiscuous. Mamish classic Gilead Arayis. It was a mamzer. Mother went without a divorce and did what she did. This is what the Medrash says. One of the great Mekubalim was Rabbeinu Menachem Azaria Fanu of Italy. He wrote a sefer called Asarim Amaris. In Asarim Amaris, Maimer Chikur Din Perek Gimel Yud. Remember, he says, what happened here? What's the story? So he explains as follows, listen. He says, Yishai gets older. And I guess, if I could use this phraseology, he gets older and he decides to become more frum. And he starts worrying that he comes from Rus. So he's a Moabite Dainical. His wife is a fine Jewish woman. She's not allowed to be with him. She's a great Jewish woman. He's a grandson of Rus. Rus is a Moabite. Mayavi v'loy Mayav is fine, but the Goyel, our friend Pliny Almoini, didn't accept it. He said, my kids are going to be blemished. He says, I'm that kid. I'm not allowed to be with her. She's not allowed to. I'm not allowed to be with her. She's not allowed to be with me. So he separates from her. He doesn't want to be her machshil, not himself, not her. He's Jewish. She's Jewish, but he can't be with her. But he knows he needs to have children. So what does he do? He has a shivcha, right? Now, a shivcha, a Jewish maid, could be with a Moavi. Could be with a descendant of Moav. Not only that, even if he would liberate her, and she would become a full Jew, because a Shivcha Knainis, who is liberated just like an Evet Knaini, becomes a regular Jew, still, Kahal Avodim, Loi Nikra Kol, Kahal Geirim, she would still be able to marry him. So the Asara Mamaris says what Pshat is, what he did was, he told her as follows. He said, we're going to do a legal Mimon Afshach. If I'm Moini Veloy Amoinis, Mayavi Veloy Mayavis, so I'm good to go, then I'm liberating you. I'm liberating you, you're not my servant, you're a regular Jew, you happen to be working in the house. So now, I'm a man, I'm allowed to marry you. You're a regular Jew. Shivcha Meshucheres. If I am not allowed to marry an ordinary Jew, I'm not liberating you. So you're a Shivcha, and I'm having relations with a Shivcha. I frag the Asara Mamaris, even if he will liberate her, he could still, because she's a Meshucheres. He says, yeah, but then his children would still have a problem. Because she's a regular Jewish woman, he's a Mayavi, so the children will have a problem. But if he marries a Shivcha, so we know B'chlal Havlad Hoylech Kimar Kedushin B'chlal Havlad Hoylech Acher Apogum. With two exceptions, Goya and a Shivcha always goes according to the mother. So if it's a regular Jewish guy marries a regular Jewish woman, Mayav or Mayavis on both sides, it goes to the children, all generations, either side, no difference. But if you would marry a Gentile woman, the child follows the mother. If the mother is a non-Jew, the child is not Jewish. If the mother is a Shivcha, the child is an Evet. So he says, that's why he did it. If he's a Mayavi, so he marries a Shivcha. So the child is what? An Evet, doesn't have lineage to him legally. Now if that child becomes liberated, he's a regular Jew, his children are good to go. This is how the Rameh Mipanu argues what David HaMelech did. This was his pilpul. So again, if I'm regular Jew, you're liberated. If not, you're a Shivcha. Yishai. What happens? The Shivcha was also a Shtikalamden. She said, I got no issues with Boyaz. Boyaz said, I'm good. Your wife is good enough for you. Don't become frum on your wife's cheshbon. So she goes and tells his wife. So that night he's with his wife. He thinks with his Shivcha. They have a baby, David. He thinks David is a mamzer. Comes the Medrash and says this went on for 28 years. Imagine David's life for 28 years. 28 years old. Shmuel Hanavi shows up one day and says, Lam is in the kinderlach. Brings him the 7 children. He says, no. Brings him David. The brothers are about to faint. This guy. Of course I understand why he didn't bring him as one of the children. He was not his child from Yishai's perspective. Why should he bring him? It's an Yishai kid. So Shmuel says, you have any other children? You have any other children? Oh, we have a shepherd. But it's not really his child. It's his wife's child. It's not his child. Somebody else's child. There was no Edom, there was no Asra. They kept the child, but this was not my child. And Shmuel, to everybody's astonishment, this is the one. And this is the moment when the maid opened her mouth. 28 years later, she began to speak and she told a story. And the Medrash says, at that moment, David HaMelech said a pasuk. Which pasuk? Oidcha Hashem ki anisani vatehili lishua. And his mother spoke up. And his mother said, Even ma'asu haboinim, hoysel eroish pina. That rock that the builders discarded, rejected. Hoysel eroish pina, this is the cornerstone. That boy that everyone said is the outcast. Nothing is coming from him. Hoysel eroish pina. The brothers are standing there. 28 years living like this. They want to bury themselves. They declare, May Eis Hashem hoysel. He niflos ba'inei. Everybody together says, Zeh hayoim asa Hashem nagila v'nismechavai. Next time you say Hallel, you'll know the context behind those psukim. It's not just psukim. Those are psukim. They capture a story. Now I ask you a shayla, what happened to Yishai? His whole life, he has 7 children from this one mother. One day becomes frum. I can't live with you, I'm a Moabite. What happened to him? Sagt the Brisker Rav. The Brisker Rav, in his Torah on Rus, says a word to answer the question of the Marsha and Rashi with which we began the Shir. Rambam Hilchas Mamrim Perik Beis articulates two aspects of Torah Shabbal Peh. One is Yud Gimel Midil Shah Torah Nidreshes Bahen. The second, Halacha L'Moshe Messinai. Meaning, we have a text of Chumash. That's the text of Torah Shebiksav. We all know the text is cryptic, and the text still needs a lot of interpretation, plus there are so many new laws that we have to deduce from the text. What do? So we have the formulas that Moshe Rabbeinu gave over, through which Chazal have the authority to interpret Torah based on those formulas. Kal v'choyme gzeir shove binyanav davra lamed menyane klalu prat. And then you have the lamed beis midas. And these are the methods through which they interpret Torah according to the principles given to Moshe Rabbeinu. Who has that authority? Sanhedrin, Beis Din. What if there's an argument? A lot of it is based on logic, principles, applications, methodology, ideology. So the pasuk says, "Acharei Rabbim lahatos." This is the system through which Torah Shabbal Peh develops. But the Rambam says there's something else called Halacha L'Moshe Messinai. Halacha L'Moshe Messinai are those laws that were given over. The Gemara says in Sukkah, Shiurin, Chatzitzin, Umechitzin, Gudachis, Gudasik, Dinei Chtzitza, Kazayis, Kebeitze, Kegroigeris. Doesn't say in Chumash. Halacha L'Moshe Messinai. This Moshe Rabbeinu gave over orally from Har Sinai and passed on from generation to generation. Zok the Rambam, what's the difference between the two? He says as follows. If it's something that the Sanhedrin, the 71 members of Beis Din Haggadah, originating from the 71 members of the original Sanhedrin, Moshe and the 70 elders, and each one of those was anointed musmach ish mipi ish ad Moshe Rabbeinu, anointed man from man till Moshe Rabbeinu. If they interpret something based on the Yud Gimel Midos, and the majority votes yes, and then a later Beis Din comes and argues with them, and the majority of the new Beis Din, which is Gadol, argues. He says the halacha changes. Ubasa el hakoyin el hashayfet asher yiyeh bayamim hahem. If they argue and the new psak din, that's the psak din. But with halacha l'Moshe Messinai, the Rambam says, you can't argue. It's like the text. Moshe Rabbeinu gave this over halacha l'Moshe Messinai. Tefillin got to be black. So you'll say, but I can deduce it should be this way, that. It's halacha l'Moshe Messinai, it's irrefutable. Zok the Brisker of Boya said, Amoini v'lo yamoinis me'ov me'ov is based on what? It was based on the Yud Gimel Midas. It was based on the principles of how we interpret Torah, as the Gemara itself explains the logic. Kol kvud bas malach pnima, hinehi ba'oihel. The logic dictates it shouldn't include ma'ov. So Boaz made a psak din. Came the Goyel, Ploini Almoini, and he tells Boaz, you're right, I got no problem. I'll marry her. For me, it won't be a lav. Why won't it be a lav? Beis Din said we're allowed to marry a Moabite woman. It's not a lav. You know what I'm worried about? I'm worried about in 400 years. V'tzachuv shtel nanaya Sanhedrin. And they're going to say, Boaz got it wrong. Torah lo b'shamayim. And this was not b'shamayim. Boaz was not b'shamayim either. So now what happens? I'm good. But my children, my descendants, 100 years from now, 200 years from now, they look at them, they say, you come from Rus. Havlad hoylech acher apogum. You can't marry. Pen ashchis es nachalosi zog the Brisker of. For me, it's not an issue. Boaz said. But since it's based on the Yud Gimel Midas, it can be refuted in 50 years. What happens when it's refuted in 50 years? My children will be affected. Boaz, you're an old man. He was 80 years old. You're not planning to have kids. You marry her, gesundheit. I still have to worry about shidduchim, like some of you. I still got to worry about my kids. I can't just become, I can't just do, you set up psak din. There's a process here. Although this man was also pretty old, probably. He was Boaz's uncle. I don't think he was that young, unless you have situations where it could be, the uncle is the same age or even younger. But the situation here, he says, about me, I'm not worried. I'm worried about my kids. The emissus, the Briskerov, writes this. I saw the Ben Ish Chai has an interpretation on Rus. And in a few lines, he says the same thing a century earlier. So generally, it's quoted everywhere in the name of Reb Velvela Brisker, Reb Yitzchak Zev Alevi Soloveitchik Zatzal. But a century earlier, the Ben Ish Chai writes this in his Pirush HaRus. I think it's called Eim HaMelech. Now we understand the Gemara in Yevamos. Shaul asked Avner, what's with this guy? Doyek said, we're not sure. Avner said, Taneina. Taneina. What's Taneina? Taneina is Madgalenint. We have a tradition. Doyek said, very nice. Where did this tradition come from? The way you interpret it, I'm going to tell you they interpreted wrongly. I'll show you their seichel is wrong. Let's make a new psak. And Shaul says he's right. Go to the Beis Medrash. They go to the Beis Medrash. They go to Bezdin. Doyek presents a good taina. They say he's right. Boaz said what he said, but we got to change the law. Chogar atzmoi becheref. Amasa girdles himself with a sword. And he says, Kach mekublani mi beis dinoi shel Shmuel haramas. What's Negea the name here? Kach mekublani mi beis dinoi shel Shmuel haramasi. Amoini v'lo yaimon is the chiddush of Kach mekublani is. This is a Kabbalah from the Bezdin of Shmuel haramasi who gave over the tradition. Shmuel was one of the Chachmei HaMesorah that the Rambam enumerates in the introduction to the Yad HaChazakah. That's why the name is so important. Boaz was also a shofet. But mi beis dinoi shel Shmuel haramasi amoini v'lo yamoinis, it's halacha l'Moshe miSinai. If it's halacha l'Moshe miSinai, there's no refutation. Boaz wasn't just saying this because of logic. He was saying this halacha l'Moshe miSinai. That's why it's like a cherev. It's a sword. It's absolute. It's non-negotiable. There's no two ways about it. It has the sharpness and the clarity of the sword. That's why Yishai is still in doubt. Why is Yishai in doubt? He's in doubt because Boaz knew. So I'm doing the right thing. But what about my children, my grandchildren? At least let me have one child who won't have this issue. So that's why he does this whole pilpul with his maid. Because it's still assumed that it's one of the Yud Gimel Midas. The Chiddush of Kach Mekublani Beis Din Shel Shmuel haramasi is that it's halacha l'Moshe miSinai. How do you know how right the Brisker Rav is and the Ben Ish Chai is? Not that they need my haskama, but I took a look in Rambam Hilchis Isurei Bia, where the Rambam discusses the halacha of Amoini v'lo yamoinis, Mayavi v'lo mayavis. Zog the Rambam, listen to words. Hilchis Isurei Bia Perik Yud Beis Halacha Yud Ches. Amoinu Mayav Isurin Isur Oilam Scharim v'lo nekeves Shenema lo Yavei Amoini Mayavi. And then the Rambam writes, V'halacha l'Moshe miSinai she'amoini yazachar v'amayavi yazachar hu she'asur la'olam lisa bas Yisrael afilu ben b'noi at soif ha'olam. Halacha l'Moshe miSinai that the male can't marry a Jewish girl, even his grandson to the end of history. Aval amoinis u'mayavis muteres miyad kishar ha'omais. Where did the Rambam know that it's halacha l'Moshe miSinai? It doesn't say anywhere in Shas, not in Bavli, not in Yerushalmi. Today we can check it up where it says that. Where did the Rambam know it's halacha l'Moshe miSinai? Because the Rambam understood that's the whole chiddush of Amasa kach mekoblani mi beis dinoi shel Shmuel haramasi. What was he mechadash that they didn't know before? He said the same thing that Avner said. He said the same thing they said in Beis Medrash. What he was mechadash was, this is a halacha l'Moshe miSinai, and it's irrefutable. And that's why Boaz did not have to worry about his children, where the Goyal still thought he has to worry about his children. But now we have one final piece left. And that is, okay, fine. But why did it have to happen this way? And why really the need for the sword? So we explained the cherev as a euphemism, as an expression, that it's absolute, it's non-negotiable. But it's really the sword. Yitokir b'cherev is going to be pierced with a sword. So here, let's, in the last leg of the shir, go into the realm of Pnimiyus HaTorah, of Kabbalah, of Chassidus. It's not just Rus and Boyaz, Mayavi, Veloy Mayavis. The situation is far more complex, far more mysterious. How do we say in the Tanoim, Ha'oimid Mitzad HaChosin, Ha'oimid Mitzad HaKala? If you want to look at Mitzad HaChosin, it's quite mysterious. And Mitzad HaKala, it's quite mysterious. Let's start Mitzad HaChosin, Boyaz. We have here a Shidduch, Boyaz and Rus. Mitzad HaChosin, where does Boyaz come from? Boyaz is a grandson of Peretz. Peretz is a son of Yehuda, who was born from a very difficult and mysterious relationship between Yehuda and Tamar, which was completely not conventional. Yehuda is walking, and Tamar is disguised, as the Pasuk says in Vayeshev as a Zoyna, and Yehuda goes over the road, and they're connected, and they live together, and she has a child, and this is where Peretz is born, and this is the Zayda of Boyaz. That's Mitzad HaChosin. If you go weiter down, Mitzad HaChosin, so Boyaz gives birth, Boyaz has a son Ovid, and Ovid has a son Yishai, and for David to be born, Yishai again is with somebody who he thinks is somebody else. He thinks he's with his maid, he's really with his wife, and that's the source of David HaMelech, who for 28 years was perceived as a Muzar Yisrael B'nayach. And to get from David to Shloimeh, we have this extremely enigmatic, painful, difficult, tragic, almost incomprehensible story of David and Bathsheba. Comes the Rambam in Hilchos Malachim and Paskins from Chazal that Mashiach has to come Mizera David Ushloim, exactly from this lineage. Now let's go Mitzad HaKala. Mitzad HaKala doesn't get very much more. I mean, it gets a little more exciting. Mitzad HaKala we have Rus. Rus comes from Moav. What's Moav's yichus? Lot was drunk one night. His daughters made a very good pina colada and a little sharper than that. Lot is mamish, tight, shikik, completely intoxicated, has relations with his daughter, he doesn't know what hit him, and the first boy, of course, that comes out of that relation is Moav, who has the same father and the same Zayda, and Rus comes from that lineage. And she now marries Boyaz, and her own shidduch with Boyaz is complicated. The Alshich and all the Mefarshim want to know why couldn't Naomi, a finer Rebbetzin, send a Shatchin to Boyaz. She sends Rus in the middle of the night. Vayilofes, Boyaz is trembling while he's winnowing the fields. What's going on over there? The Alshik says, what happened to Derech, Bnei Yisrael, Aksheris? What happened to Tzlias? Rus comes from Moav, and now her relation with Boyaz is extremely mysterious. And then, of course, the story with Yishai, and the story with David, and the story of Bathsheba. And one wonders, why is this the lineage from which Malchus, royalty, is created among Klal Yisrael, Malchus Beis David, Malchus of Yehuda, and ultimately the Malchus of the Geula of Mashiach, all from this lineage. There's a Peladik Medrash in Bereshis Rabbah in Parshas Vayeshev on the Pasuk in Tehillim. Matzasi David Avdi B'Shem and Kachi Meshach. I have found David my servant. I have discovered him. I found him. I've anointed him with holy oil. Frek the Medrash. Matzasi? He was lost. Heichen Matzasi. Where did I find David? You know what the answer is? Bizdaim. I found David in Zdaim. Lot was in Zdaim. And Lot's daughters are the mothers, the babas of Rus. So where did I find David? I found David in Zdaim. Pshat in the Medrash. Matzasi David Avdi Bizdaim. The Gemara says in Sanhedrin, three things come behesach hadas. Mitzia Akrav Mashiach. Hesach hadas. So there's a lot to say on this, as you know, but I'm going to say, Bekitz and Nimritz, 2 points. Point number one, I saw it first in the Shem Shmuel on Shavuos, Tofresh Ayin, 1910. He says it in the name of his father, the Avnei Nezer, Rebbe Avram from Sachatshov, who says it in the name of his father-in-law, the Kotzker Rebbe. But I was quite shocked to see the Vart. So I started to do some research, and I saw that a very similar thing says in Zohar. Even though the Shem Shmuel doesn't quote it, in Zohar Chadash on Rus, there's a shtickle Zohar on Rus, and the Zohar Chadash says it. It'll drop different, but the same teich. Shmuel quotes the Avnei Nezer, quotes the Kotzkin, as I tell you, it says in Zohar Chadash, and that is that the concept of Melucha was not possible by the Jewish people. The concept of royalty, of kingship, was not available to the Jewish people. The Jewish people had to get it from Moav. We didn't have it. We didn't have it. Why? Why? He says, a melech is a paradox. On one hand, the king has to be extremely humble, because absolute power corrupts absolutely, and if the king is not very humble, he becomes a dangerous man. The Gemara says in Brachas, Hamelech kivon shekara shuv einoi zoykef. An ordinary Jew, you say Baruch Atah, and then you lift up your head by Hashem and you go on. A melech, the moment you say Baruch Atah shuv einoi zoykef till the end of Shemoneh Esrei, his head is down. Is that nice? Everyone is standing Shemoneh Esrei and the melech is down. If you want, you could punch him over his head if you don't like him. The pshat is because he's a melech. He needs that real, sincere humility, because if not, we know the story of kings. Many monarchs were crazy, and even if they were normal, sometimes the levels of sadism and dictatorship and tyranny were heinous, and there was nobody to stop them. Where the Jewish kings, you had a Nasan Hanavi to come up to speak truth to power and say there's nobody above the law. A melech ha'er, a melech ha'hin, there's nobody above the law. What does the Medrash say about Shlomo HaMelech? Yibatlu Shlomo ve'elef kemoisoi v'al tibatel ois achas min ha'Torah. On the other hand, for a melech to be a melech, he has to have a certain toikif, he has to have a certain strength. What was the issue of Shaul? Shaul told Shmuel, I couldn't do what I had to do with Amalek. Why? I was afraid of the people. And what did Shmuel tell him? Im kotoin atobeinecha lo yirosh la'al for Yisrael, in your own eyes you may be small, but you have to understand the position. You have to understand the throne. They say about the Ramah, I think in Krakow, he had some opposition. K'minhag HaYehudim. So somebody once said, Krakow is a ir ve'em b'Yisrael, is a big city. How could such a small Jew be a rav of such a big city? He says, Ich bin a kleiner, but the Beikel is a größer. I may be small, but the throne, the uniform, the position is a large. Im koten ata beinecha. You may look at yourself as a nobody, but Rosh, people see you as the king. It's not about who you are, it's what you represent. The king represents something. Zakta Kotzker, there was no malucha by the Jews because, he says this, he says, I ask you a question. And when you have a body, when you have one organism, can you say that one limb should be a king over another limb? It's a joke. We all came out together of the same womb. We all grew up together. Well, I'm your king, you're my king. He says, Yidden are one guf mamish. How can one of them be a king? He says, it's one body mamish. How can there be malucha? There can't be malucha. They had to get it from Moav. Because on the other hand, a melucha requires a certain sense of isnasus, exaltedness, a certain sense of aloofness, of sublimity. It could not exist among the Jewish people. It's ish echad, it's leiv echad. It's one unified organism. You can't have one limb ruling over another limb. By Jews you can have humility, you can't have real melucha. This was Shaul's issue, and David HaMelech brought it to the Jewish people because he got it from Moav. That's the pshat, that Amasa girdle himself with a sword. He wasn't just making a shtick. He was explaining why. Why? If we would be able to survive only on humility, gesundheit. If we would be able to survive always on our koil Yaakov, that would be lovely. But at some point, Yaakov had to put on the clothes of Esau. Somebody once said about the Jewish people, what's a Jew? He finally makes a fist, and the next step is Shamnu, Bagadnu, Gazalnu, Al Chet, Al Chet, Al Chet. Mr. Putin takes his eyes, he looks at the Ukraine or Crimea, and he says, I like it. Boom, the troops go in, and people barely utter a pips. Israel, more than 40 years ago, fought a defensive war where they wanted to annihilate it. It liberated territories that it had for thousands of years as Jewish territories, and it's still apologizing. You make a fist, al chait, al chait, al chait, I'm sorry for existing. The Jew has to have a balance between the Simcha Binim, Anoichi Ofa Ve'efer, and Bishvili Nivra Olam. This quality, says David, got from Moav. Who's David? Read David HaMelech of Tehillim and read David HaMelech of Tanakh and tell me, as with one person or two people. David HaMelech of Tehillim is Anoichi Soilas V'lo Yish. I'm a worm. I'm a little infant in the bosom of my mother. The Ishtapchus HaNefesh of Tehillim. In Tanakh, David is a grand warrior. Who is David? It's the Zelbe David. The same David who says, "V'chatosi negdi samid, v'cheitye chamasni imi, hein b'yavon choylolti." I was conceived in sin. And we understand these psukim much better from the above medrash quoted earlier. And the same David HaMelech stands up to Goliath, stands up to the great enemies and fights. This, says the Kotzker, we had to get from Moav. He says, you know why this had to happen? You know why he comes from Rusa Moavia? Doyeg has a taina, fine. You'll find me, Alep Shetlach, the brisket of will prove to me that it's halacha l'Moshe Sinai. But tell me, is it past? Is it past? This is your king? Which yeshiva would let in David HaMelech today? I want to know. Which yeshiva? And which seminary would let Rus in? Is there one seminary would let Rus in? Mayavi v'loy Mayavis. Mitazah yichis loit. But that's where royalty of the Jewish people comes. So Zamaisa, there was once a person, he was in a mentally challenged institution, and finally he was freed, and he tells the doctor, give me a note. Give me a note that I'm normal. So the doctor gives him a note that he's normal. Goes over to somebody in the street, 13th Avenue. He says, Rabbi Shalom Aleichem, tell me you're normal. He says, of course. He says, prove it. He says, I can't. He says, I could. Takes out a note. The doctor says, B'Shem Malchus, I'm normal. So who's more normal, you or me? I'm normal. So Baruch Hashem, we have halacha l'Moshe Sinai that David HaMelech could marry a Yiddish maid. Aglik is megisha. Why? Chagaratz mekecheref. There's something they had to get from Rusa Moavia. And David inserts it. But finally, there's a lot more explanation, but I want to give one more and conclude. And this is based on the Torah of the Maharal in Netzach Yisrael, by Rizal and Shar HaGilgulim Hagdama Lamed Ches, and many other sources in Torah Sanister. And it's quite a powerful idea with, I think, a lot of relevance for our life, for all days. And the best way to describe it, perhaps, is revolutions must emerge from secret pathways and tunnels. If revolutions emerge through normal, ordinary, organized, accepted processes, they are stifled, crushed, and destroyed before they even have a chance to bud. If you're going to introduce an idea, a conviction, a reality, an energy that is truly revolutionary, truly unprecedented, truly challenges people to go out of their comfort zone, which is probably one of the most difficult things in life, as we each know in our own lives. If you want to bring it through the front entrance with a big sign, Bruchim Abayim, Yamim Al Yemei Melech Toisif, Chacham Baliyir, you'll be killed before you even open your mouth. You got to bring it in through secret underground tunnels and create it as a reality. And then, perhaps, it can be successful. May I give a very simple illustration? If you go to an opera house, if you go to a Carnegie Hall, if you go to any large auditorium or center where a major talent, a singer, a cantor, a musician, an actor, or some extraordinary world-renowned celebrity is going to be performing. And there are the front entrances. And the front entrances are beautiful. They're decorated, they're designed, they're geschmack. So much money was invested in them. And that's where the oilam is going in through. They're showing their tickets and they're going in through. You would think Kol Shekain V'Kal V'Chomer, where should the great celebrity be taken into from? Through the front doors. Pischu L'Sharei Tzedek. Su'u Sharim Rasheichem V'Yavei Melech HaKavod. As a metaphor. But we all know that's the worst mistake. Never bring your celebrity through the front doors. Where do they bring him in through? Tunnels, alleyways, side doors, exit doors. Chatar loy machteres. Why? I don't understand. Let him come through the front. Sushan Rasheichem. The answer is, what happens? If you bring him in through the front doors, he'll never get to the stage. He'll never get to the stage. He'll remain stuck in the back for the rest of his life. You got to sneak him in from places where nobody hangs out, nobody expects he's going to be there. Some fahakta door, fahakta tunnel that's filled with rodents and roaches and mice and roads from before the Eitz Hadas. And that's where he crawls in and gets his closed door and he come here, come there, come there, come there. Ezda hayeled, ezda ani kan hakal kan. When the light of the Geula, when the light of Mashiach had to be planted in the world, it could not come in through the conventional methods. Holy parents, holy children, wholesome families, situations that lend themselves logically to this type of energy. Why? There's no way the koiches of klipa, the koiches of negativity, would allow this to happen. The opposition would be so powerful that in no way the seed of Mashiach, the seed of the ultimate Malchus of Yisrael, which would represent the V'hoisel Hashem Amlucha, V'hoy Hashem L'melech HaKol Haaretz, would ever be able to be successful, be nipped in the bud before it begins. So how was the seed brought in? Secret pathways, secret tunnels. In the words of the Rambam, about something else, about the Aron, Hilchis Beis HaBchira, b'matmoiniyos amukois v'akalkalois. Curved, hidden, winding, secret pathways. That's how it was brought in. When Alta Yid, I knew his name was Reb Mendel Futefas. He spent 10 years in Siberia. He was exiled 10 years in Siberia. So over there, a lot of experience. So he said in his barrack, there was a time, lights out, so to speak, you had to go to sleep. And he was in a barrack, he said, with ganovim, gazlonim. And they liked playing cards at night. But it was forbidden. It was forbidden. And then, the supervisor, the warden, would know about this, and he always tried to catch them. So he says, the Nachalnik would come in, the door, and he would look for the cards to confiscate them, and he could never find them. And he says, Reb Mendel says, he always wondered, where do these Ganovim put the cards? The guy overturns the entire barrack. Worse than B'dikas Chametz. Everywhere. He can't find the cards. So he once asked the Rosh Ganovim, he says, I see you playing the cards. The guy walks in, it's gone. Where do you put it? You with Yosel Agoylam, how do you do it? So they say what we do is the Nachalnik comes in. We're professional pickpocketers. Mishanim Kadmeniyas. We know how to do. We put it into his pocket. Melek das rein in the Ganev's Keshena. Bei sich in Keshena sicht man nicht. You're searching everybody else's pockets. In your own pocket, where are you going to search? So he searches everywhere, searches, can't find it. On the way out, we take it out of his pocket and we're good to go. The Rebbeinu Shalom knew you want the seed of Mashiach, darf man sein einlegen in the Keshena from the Ganev. You got to put it into the pocket of the thief. They're not going to search for it. Who's going to go to the tunnel? A foul, disgraceful tunnel to look for that seed. So suddenly Lot is drunk. That's where it gets smuggled in. Yehuda and Tamar, Rus and Boaz, Yishai and his maid, really his wife, David Bathsheba. But that seed is being planted. Sagt the Chidah. We just said at the end of Parshas B'chukoisai. Lo yevaker bein tov l'ra. V'lo yimirenu. V'im homer yimirenu. Hu usmurasai yiyeh kodesh. Smurasai is Rus v'tamar. Lo yimirenu. The animal is holy. V'im hama yimirenu. If you substitute it for something that's unholy, it's mundane. V'hayahu smurasai yekaidish. It's lo yimirenu. We don't go there. But v'im hama yimirenu, you should know. The tmurasai, Rus and Tamar, that's where the kedusha is coming in from. And that's the meaning of the Medrash. Matzasi David Avdi, Heichal Matzasi. Where did I find it? I found it where? Bizdoim. The greatest lights, the greatest energies, the greatest potentials, the most glorious opportunities lay often in places where you expect them least. Greatness lay in people, in hearts, in conditions, and in situations we expect them least. There are those children we look at and we say, Even ma'asu habaynim. There's nothing there. Be careful. If you'll open your eyes and you'll expand your horizons, and you'll go out of your comfort zone, you'll see that in Zdoim you have the light of Mashiach. We look at ourselves sometimes and we're in situations that seem hopeless, ridiculous, absurd, meaningless, valueless. It's situations of Zdoim. Zdoim is no great city. Quite to the contrary. But if you work with those situations, you could find that often, that's where there's the Matzasi David Avdi, the Beshemen Kachim Shachtev. Have a wonderful evening and a good Yom Tov.